Einen wunderbaren guten Nachmittag, liebe Republika. Wie schön, euch zu sehen und auch ein ganz herzliches Hallo an euch im
A very warm
Stream.
welcome to all of you here and in the stream. Glad that you're here. I hope you had something tasty for lunch, because in this session we are going to enter into what I would call the mental primordial soup of humanity, an issue that has been engaging people even in antiquity and something that is even current for us today, and that is the search for identity. If you go through the supermarket, you may read your yogurt pot with a slogan such as "Be yourself." Well, it sounds great, but how hard is it sometimes to be yourself? How hard is it to find what you are yourself and to actually be comfortable with what you are and then actually live that life? And if I think about myself, then the search for myself is actually one of the most interesting and fruitful, but wow, one of the most stressful things I can imagine. And if I think of myself, I think of myself as a cis woman, someone who was born with a vulva and who can still identify with a vulva. And thinking of someone like myself, who was never confronted with the question what the two people next to me had to go through and have to go through still, and that is how I perceive myself, and to not see that as a fashion trend or something that is met with hatred or even violence. And for that to change for future generations, to have it a very natural thing to be queer or trans, just like anything else, that is what you've been working for years. And I think, most of all, dear Tessa, dear Henry, a huge thank you for your courage, for your never-ending engagement for an open society. And I think I can invite you all for a large applause for these two. Thank you. Tessa, you are an early riser, a coffee drinker, left-handed. You are targeted and sometimes a bit scratchy, I'm told. That's how you started your speech when you were standing as a candidate for the German Parliament, the Bundestag, and that is how you became one of the first two trans women in the Bundestag. In 2018, you were in the Bavarian state parliament, and you made public your identity as the first trans member of parliament, and that gave you prominence beyond Germany. And to be in that focus, I wonder how it is for those that cannot experience this. Could you actually count how often you were attacked for what other people read on their yogurt pots and simply can celebrate, which is being themselves? Well, regarding this whole hatred in social media, I just don't want to deal with it, just because they are screaming and just utter the most disgusting things. It doesn't mean that they're a majority. I would much rather focus on the beautiful moments and human encounters that I have experienced. Henry, you are a musician and an author. You have been on various stages, and you published your mini solo album, Biceps, and you have a podcast, Transformer, in which you made public your identity and again entered different stages, for example, at the previous Republika, where we could meet in person. And again, the question to you, Henry, what is it like for you, the attacks on what you are? Is that still countable, or do you too focus on the other side? Well, just as Tessa said, sadly, the haters are much louder, but it doesn't mean that there is more of them. And I experience great things, I meet excellent people. And what I don't understand is how people can think that they have so much time that they can spend it on just spouting hatred and spending their energy on something like this. That is completely mysterious to me. I focus on the good things, and I think I'm doing very well with that. Thank you. Thank you. Very welcome. One thing I thought of in preparation is that you are experts in finding identities because, as I said in the introduction, this is a completely different challenge. And society hasn't created the best conditions for you. Before we go into your individual identities, let's first ask the people here, perhaps, did you, as experts on finding identities, do you have tips for all of us how we can support being true to oneself, no matter which orientation we may have? Would you like to start? Yes. I do believe that taking your time is important because you do know best yourself. Don't listen to your fears, because fear is a very bad advisor. And in my opinion, the gut actually knows what the issue is. Get informed, get smart, but stay calm. You don't have to decide from one day to the other, even though this is the message that you often get. And if you are open, you can become and be what you are, and it's not maybe possible from one day to the next. So take the time you need. That would be my advice, really. A good bit of advice. Tessa, what about you? Well, I don't know what to say, really. It's not my fault. I was born this way. Life taught me. Although, my goodness, it's more than 20 years that I am not living in Bavaria anymore. They can still hear it. You can still hear it in my dialect, my accent. And I still identify as someone from the Bavarian forest. If there is anything I'd identify with, I still identify. I don't identify as a human, I am a human. So that's why I don't much like this terminology about identity that much. I am a woman, my name is Tessa Ganserer, and it's not about finding an identity, it's recognizing myself, accepting myself, and living what I am and being accepted as I am. Yes, do applaud if you want to. If I think back to what you just said, recognizing yourself, for myself, this all had a lot to do with role images presented in the media. We talked about this, and first the question, I guess, would be, if I think back to my process of recognizing myself, then trans people were not actually tangible in the media at all. You would assume that this has changed. Would you say it has changed? That would be my first question now. And first question, yes. Would you agree with that there is more prominence for trans and inter people in the media?
Okay, well, I could talk about this very extensively, but to keep things short, I just recommend everyone I would recommend to everyone the documentary Disclosure on Netflix, which is about the representation of gender diversity in fiction, film, and TV. And unfortunately, I couldn't finish watching it because it made me so sad. I tried twice, but I only made it halfway through. And it's exactly the way I experienced it. To say that didn't exist back in the day, that's not true. Gender diversity in film and TV is as old as moving images, but until today, usually there are terrible narratives that are being shown, almost exclusively these terrible narratives, even today. For example, such as trans people always experiencing incredibly tragic stories, are very shady characters that are usually often end as murder victims or are psychopaths or are played for cheap laughs. And I mean, yeah, that's something that I still know from my own childhood. And it was clear to me that that's not me. And so we still lack diversity in that respect. Trans being portrayed as something completely normal, just self-evident, that trans characters appear in film and TV, but not with these artificial narratives. What I'm missing are, for example, gay trans men who is chasing down economic, tax criminals as a policeman, or for example, a trans physics professor who receives an important prize for her research, where her being trans is just kind of like, it's just a thing that just happens to be the case. For example, in other stories where someone, oh yeah, that person used to have like a certain disease, or maybe just has like this particular type of high school degree. So that's really what I would wish for, right? Where being trans is kind of just like a thing on the side. And that's really what I want. And for there to be these positive role models where it's possible for people to recognize themselves. So for those of you who might be searching for a new story, there might be some ideas here. But Henry, would you also say that something has changed, or would you agree with Tessa? No, I would agree with Tessa. As she said, I think she explained it very well. What I would add, being trans is always the center of everything. It's the central topic, the central question. It's never just a thing on the side, as an aside. Why is that the case? It's because people who are not familiar with this topic and who aren't trans or queer or whatever, they wonder, they're thinking about, telling themselves, oh, I'm going to imagine like a character, like a trans person. Oh yeah, and most trans people are sex workers, right? So, oh yeah, great. Yeah, now we have diversity because this movie has a trans character, so now we have diversity, so what else do you want? But that's exactly the crux of it, that it's supposed to represent my reality, which is very far removed from this. So you'd have to start at a much earlier point, right? For example, when people are writing scripts, that writing process, the writer's room should involve trans and queer writers, and then producers and directors should include trans people, rather than someone saying, oh, well, we need some kind of trans character. Oh, a sex worker. Well, that's what we're going to do. You know? It's really, you should not just think about filling some kind of quota or just writing something that everyone is going to think is going to be very hip and that's going to draw in a lot of viewers, but you really should try to depict a certain kind of reality. I think that would really help a lot of people. Yeah, and it would also be more correct. So for those of you who might be interested in the topic queer in media, after this, there's also going to be another panel on this topic at stage 2, where they will dive into this more deeply. So, following up on role models in the media, there are also structural issues. Also thinking of politics, where you, Tessa, are at home. And the two of you, even though you both said very nicely that you want to focus on the positive things, when I think of the political environment, it does feel like there are many things that still remain to be done. So that would be my questions. Politically, where do we stand? Tessa, I mean, you are fighting for the abolition of the transsexual law in Germany. So maybe you can explain to us, for those who don't know about this yet, what this is about and where we might be able to go. Sorry. Okay, so we have to go back quite far, all the way back to the 80s. Until then, transgender people had absolutely no possibility to be recognized as their own gender. So transgender people, even if they essentially underwent gender affirmation surgery, they were never able to have their identity documents. They were considered unemployable. According to the courts, they didn't even have a claim to unemployment benefits. So that was kind of the judicial and political situation in the 60s and 70s. And then in the 1980s, so the early 1980s, the German parliament passed the so-called transsexual law. But this law was unjust from the very beginning. It contains a terrible, dark spirit from the past of German history, when it was the state's role to decide which life is essentially allowed to reproduce, like which people are considered as having a right to life. So, based on what psychology thought in the 60s, and basically these moral ideas from the 50s, Parliament passed the so-called transsexual law. And the German Constitutional Court has, in 6 individual decisions, has found that several parts of this law are unconstitutional. The last of these decisions is from 2011. At the time, the Constitutional Court decided that the requirement based on the transsexual law that trans people have to undergo a total physical gender affirmation surgery for them to be recognized as the person who they are, that this requirement violated the constitutional right to bodily health. And so that paragraph cannot be implemented or applied anymore since then. It happens that politicians make bad laws. That's what the Constitutional Court is there for. It regularly checks these laws and looks them over. And there are always constantly decisions that say that certain laws need to be revised. Then essentially it's politicians need to sit down and do their homework. But with the so-called transsexual law, it hasn't been touched in 6 years. So until now, even the European Council, they decided a resolution in 2015 which asks the member states to offer simple, fast procedures for people to be able to change their gender and or name in their ID documents. Several European countries have already started that process, but in Germany, up to this date, essentially need to apply at this court, submit a so-called transgender CV, submit it to a judge and have to be questioned very intimately by 2 psychologists. So in the very end, the judge can decide whether the state is going to recognize this person as the person who they are. In my opinion, that's a clear violation of human dignity, and I really don't think that I don't want that any other person has to go through these undignified, humiliating procedures anymore, and that we can get to a point with other European countries where people who are in full possession of their mental faculties can simply go to the administration that there was a mistake when they were born. I mean, I also was not asked when I was born, and even if I had been asked, I wouldn't have been able to tell them at the time. But so my birth certificate is wrong. I would like this to be corrected. Then there's a stamp. You pay some kind of money for processing, and anything beyond that really isn't the state's problem. It really doesn't concern the state. And that would really, as the Traffic Light Coalition currently in power, this is our plan, and we want to implement this in Germany as well. Henry, I know your turf isn't really politics, like for Tessa, but maybe from your perspective, there's also something you may have perceived as a musician, as someone who is involved in culture. Have you perceived anything that needs to change politically? What Tessa said, independent of what I do as a job, that's really influenced my life enormously. I don't know if everyone understood this. So the TSG, this so-called transsexual law, you can use that to change your gender marker and your name. I don't know if this has been transported properly, but until 2011, these rules said that you had to be sterilized. So we need to say this very explicitly. You had to be sterilized, and that was only abolished in 2011. Yeah, and I mean, these assessments, psychological assessments, are very expensive. You have to go through these incredibly intimate questions about how do you have sex, and you wonder, what does this have to do with anything? And the answer is nothing. And then you have this appointment with a judge. You need to talk about these every day. You need to have these proven everyday experiences. All of this is just such quackery. I don't know who came up with this. Yeah, I mean, it's really just a terrible, terrible process. It takes a long time, it's expensive, you have to pay for these assessments yourself. In my case, these cost 600 euros each. That's money you need to have in the first place. Yeah, and then this whole process is just terrible because it's constantly other people deciding over yourself, and you constantly have to dependent on other people being nice to you and essentially doing what you're asking, and that needs to go. Yeah, I mean, I also was wondering who decides that this person even has the power to make an assessment like this. I really wonder, so who, this assessor, who is that, and how do they become the person? How do they get that much power? Yeah, I mean, that's also what these assessors and these therapists who write these assessments say. They say it's complete quackery because in terms of gender identity and belonging, that's something that people can only essentially tell you themselves. And even a professional organization for psychotherapists, a major one in Germany, is saying that this needs to be abolished because it makes no sense. And so even when it's people who are doing this professionally and they say it's nonsense, then I really think as a society we should listen to them if you already don't want to believe us. And time, over time we've decided who can marry, and back in the day, these rules about deciding who can marry who, we've overcome all of those things. And similarly, it should also be a thing of the past that trans people have to undergo a psychological assessment to prove that they're trans enough so the state recognizes them as who they are. We're very much looking forward to this legislative period and hopefully a law for self-determination. So our session is called Some People Are Trans, Deal With It. And yeah, of course, deal with it. But sometimes I wonder, how do you not just deal with trans people, but do so in a conscientious way and do so well? And this is maybe where we get to kind of traps that maybe people sometimes wonder, what can I ask? What is an okay question to ask? And maybe what are questions that you would rather not be asked, where you would say, don't ask those questions. So do you have any suggestions for people? Maybe, Henry, you can go first. This question, and I'm not talking about openly discriminatory questions, obviously. That's also what you excluded in your song. Of course, those you shouldn't ask. But do these questions exist, and which ones should we avoid? Oh, well, I don't know. People always make this fuss as if trans people were something incredibly special where you need to be extra careful. I think you can just use proper human rationality, politeness, respect when dealing with other people and with each other. One example. One thing that people really like to ask, which is really not a great start for a small talk conversation, what it looks like in your pants, because that's something that always happens. And so really my hot tip is don't ask that, because that's something that keeps happening. And beyond that, just be polite, respectful, attentive. I don't think there's anything in particular that you need to be paying attention to. I mean, the questions that you wouldn't ask in normal human conversation, don't ask those, and others that you would ask, you can ask them. Oh yeah, I guess that makes sense, because no one's asked me what things look like in your pants. That's probably not a great conversation starter. You would think that. Tessa, do you have questions where you say, please avoid those questions? I don't even know who to start. Maybe with language. I think language also reproduces and represents societal conditions. And since in our Western civilization, the topic or question of trans has been taboo and stigmatized for decades and centuries, that's something we still notice in our language. For example, why is this adjective trans always being emphasized? We don't talk about blonde women or pot-bellied politicians. So it's always this reduction and focus on this single marker, the single adjective. I think for me and Henry, both of us are represented by way more other things, and we're also divided and different in way more other aspects. One thing where it's also very obvious is in written language. I really can't read it anymore when people talk about like when trans people is written together and capitalized in German. We also don't capitalize and write as a single noun when we talk about blonde women. So this way of writing always makes it very obvious and clear to me that trans people are still being seen as something very special, as if we weren't part of society, as if we were somewhat suspect from a different planet. So ways of writing about that, like writing about trans people like that, that's something that I only know in other contexts from when conspiracy theorists write about reptile people that have taken over the earth. So what I would imagine and like to happen is that we just accept people as they are and don't particularly emphasize certain features. And last tip, there are so many really amazing transgender people who've written books. Read these books, learn from trans people, and just deal with us the way you would deal with anyone else, or also the way we all want to be treated as people who are seen and treated respectfully. I also would like to recommend Transformer. I learned a lot about trans there, but also something about my gender, because the last episode was also about the perception of what it means to be a woman. So strong listening recommendation for those who don't know the podcast yet. So you kind of talked about these stumbling blocks for people like me. But in addition to that, there's another question is, how can people like me show solidarity? How can we support people who are maybe in search of their own identity? How can we support trans people? Do you have any tips? Okay, as a society, as every single individual can inform themselves. Organizations can give a stage to trans people, so we ourselves can talk about our own experiences and our problems. You can learn from transgender people. You can listen to their podcasts. You can like them. You can recommend and share them. You can speak up when you see people or hear people being transphobic, making transphobic jokes. Then you can, in your social circle, you can raise your voice and speak up against that. That's really incredibly important, because it cannot be the job of marginalized groups for them to be on their own in defending themselves against this discrimination and have to fight for their own rights. Yeah, as an example, there recently was this terrible article published in Die Welt, and there also in Die Zeit. Oh, yeah. So I really think the platform is being given to the wrong people. And so I commented on this on Instagram, and I basically was like, why? What's the point of this? Why are these people allowed to spread this incredibly dangerous bullshit? And people say, well, you should do something about this, Henry. Like, write them a letter. And I'm like, why are you telling me that? Like, why aren't you telling the editors? So, for example, the editors at Die Welt, this German newspaper, are saying, tell those people that it's dangerous, incredibly dangerous and really insulting to give those people a platform. You could write those people a letter, and there's enough injustices. You just need to look at the Bild newspaper. Every time I see incredible bullshit when I open it up. Any day, if I click on anything, I'll see bullshit like that. And that's where you can raise your voice and speak up. And you can contact those newsrooms. You can sign petitions. There's also stuff happening in the streets. You can just be attentive and open your mouth. I know it's incredibly difficult, but if you're sitting at home and you read something that's just, I have to say bullshit again. When you see these things, like, write a letter to those newsrooms, write those editors and say, you can't do that. That's really a very practical thing that comes to mind for me as a practical tip. Thank you. So we started with this more general question regarding you as experts in finding your identities. Now I also have a question, what you if there's any advice that you would like to give people who might be in search of their own gender identity in general, and maybe also specifically, who could they maybe contact? Are there any places where you could get advice? Maybe, do you want to start? So in Berlin, there are many very good organizations that can give you advice. I could really recommend Trick. And in addition to that, I've learned a lot from trans people on Instagram and YouTube, simply because that's where you're really getting an unfalsified, normal view of what things are like. Yeah, and as I said earlier, really try taking your time, being gentle with yourself and treating yourself gently. I think that's my advice. That would be my advice, if it is advice. Yeah, really be gentle with yourself. That's generally something you should always be. And Tessa, from your perspective? So for starters, I would like to say I don't believe that anyone chooses this. If I had been able to choose, then I would have chosen to be anything but trans. No one is looking for their gender identity. Maybe people are currently finding themselves and are in the process of accepting themselves, because we are all products of the society. And because I've gotten to know quite a few trans people who've perceived this the same way as me. So for starters, there's this internalized societal transphobia that we need to overcome first. So after we've even recognized ourselves, we need to start accepting ourselves. And then for those people who are currently in that phase, my call to you would be, it is fine, you're fine, like it's good the way you are, you're not alone. And it's okay for you to maybe not be at a point where you want to out yourself. The point in time, the way you come out of the closet, the path through transition, that's something everyone decides for themselves, and nobody has to justify that in front of anyone. Nobody has to be ashamed in front of anyone or anything. And the internet is really a true blessing in that regard. Today, it's so easy, no matter whether you live in Berlin or growing up in the countryside, you can get information through the internet. You can get advice, you can find organizations that offer counseling, you can find counseling that you can access anonymously. And once you're at a point where you are ready to plan a coming out, start getting advised, start accessing self-help organizations that can support you in that process. Do you have any specific recommendations by any chance? We've already heard one for counseling. So across Germany, there's the Federal Association Trans. There's many local organizations. In some cities, that's one thing that I would wish for. We're working on that. There's independent counseling stations that are not just run by volunteers, but are doing this as a job. So it's not just counseling as part of peer groups. So I think for some people, these self-help groups are really important, but it can't be that this counseling and advice is only coming from volunteers and volunteer organizations. So we really want to be able to provide financial resources for that, so there can be counseling that's really done as a full-time job, and that we can build these structures in Germany. Anyway, the wind blows is the motto of Republica this year. So I would say never, regardless of where the wind blows, I hope that there are many courageous people along that way, such as you. So thanks again so much for this conversation. So I'm already looking forward to a completely different conversation, for example, about tree cultivation or music. So hopefully, next time we can just talk about something else. Thank you so much.